This is my video clinic for how to throw a backhand for distance. It's a little bit easier to do in person, but I think some of these concepts and just being able to see not only the correct form but also some common issues that people run into should be helpful still. The first thing that I like to start with is grip. When I grip the disc, I start by stretching out my hand as far as it'll go. Then I place the disc in my hand and relax my hand around it. And that just gives me some free grip in my palm. I don't have to squeeze to generate that grip. As an example, if I open up my hand as far as it'll go and put a plastic cup in it and then just relax my hand, I'll hold the cup without having to really squeeze. The next step, once the disc is in my hand, I do squeeze very, very tightly. I think you can see my thumb is denting the top of the disc a little bit. Whether you can see that or not, I'm squeezing very hard. I get a lot of grip from my first two fingers squeezing. All four fingers are under the rim. You will lose power if you let your index finger come up to the rim or just sit on the edge or something. So that's the proper grip. Notice my thumb position. It's on the flight rings, probably on the outer half of them, and as opposed to being somewhere like that in the middle of the disc. And then the last thing is I just make sure that my thumb aligns just slightly past my front knuckle there, but not by a lot. What you don't want to do is have your thumb way out in front of your knuckle like that, because you will not be able to hold the disc very effectively. And then the other extreme would be to let your index finger come out and have your finger be way ahead of your thumb. So that's it. Stretch your hand, put the disc in it, squeeze tight with your first two fingers, and put your thumb on the flight rings. Now, the way the backhand motion works is your wind-up starts with your arm going back, then your shoulders go back, then your hips go back, and that's the wind-up. Then when you start your throwing motion, it's just the opposite. Your hips come forward, pulling your shoulders, whipping your arm through. With that in mind, it's important that you maintain good posture so that you allow your hips to move freely to begin your throwing motion. Now, again, you're coming through and your hips are leading and you're staying upright and your upper body is staying either even with or behind your hips. But in order to effectively whip your shoulders around, you need your shoulders to be behind your hips. That just makes sense. If you allow your upper body to get ahead of your hips, then all of a sudden you've put yourself in a position where you can no longer generate power to pull your upper body around. It also brings in some alignment issues, which I'll talk about later. A couple of common mistakes that will restrict your hip motion and result in less power than you could otherwise generate. One thing that a lot of people do is they will take a giant step, and if you see here trying to rotate my hips, I'm almost immobile just because I've taken such a large step here. Better would be from, say, shoulder width apart, step maybe 6 inches to a foot should be plenty, and then your hips are still able to rotate pretty freely from that position. The other thing that people will do is they'll fold their body over and stick their butt out and pop their hips back, and so it takes you from your start neutral position where you can rotate your hips freely to this position where all of a sudden you've lost some of your range of motion. So from the side here, I can rotate my hips freely, and here I'm somewhat restricted. I think one of the most important parts of throwing a backhand is just making sure that you have good alignment. You have a lot of different components that have to work together in order to make a successful throw: your hips, your shoulders, your arm, your hand. And so I like to keep it as simple as possible, just to limit the number of things that can go wrong. So the first thing that I'll do is, when I begin my wind-up, I will immediately bring the disc back and rest it against my forearm. What this does is it makes sure that the disc and my forearm are in the same plane, so I can just adjust the angle of my arm if I want to adjust the angle of the disc. If instead I were to curl it up on a different plane than my arm, then I've just introduced a new variable, and I have to make sure that I somehow move my arm in a way that the disc travels in the plane that I want it to. Now, the other thing is keeping your hips, your shoulders, and your forearm all in one plane. And that, again, simplifies the motion. So I start out, I bring the disc against my forearm, and I turn, shoulders go back, disc is parallel to my arm, of course, and my shoulders are beginning to dip down a little bit, and as I wind up and load up this back leg, my the back hip is dropping a little bit. Then when I come through, my hips are throwing forward, my shoulders have dropped back onto the angle that I want, and the disc is coming through also on that same plane. So you have my shoulders are on this plane, my arm is on this plane, and I think you can see my hips are moving in that same plane as well. So everything is lined up. A lot of the posture issues that people have also affect this alignment. So if, for example, you get your weight, instead of keeping your upper body behind your hips, you let your upper body get forward, so your hips are rotating properly, but your upper body gets too far forward. Then all of a sudden your hips are moving on this plane, and you're trying to get the disc to move on this plane, except you just turned your shoulders like this. And so your hips and your shoulders are out of alignment, and the disc is out of alignment as well. As a result, it's very common, if you throw your weight too far forward in front of your hips, to throw a low line drive. So if you see yourself throwing that, then you may think about adjusting your upper body position to make sure that your hips are leading. The same issue actually comes up with the big step. Taking the big step makes it harder to keep your hips in the proper position. This takes more flexibility than simply popping your back hip up and leaning out. And so now your hips are going down, pulling your shoulders down. Again, you're much more likely to throw a low line drive. And I think you'll see this happen very frequently when people step out a little bit farther than their flexibility allows. They're no longer able to keep their hips in the right position, and instead they end up throwing something very low. Finally, if you allow your upper body to fold over when you throw, you're in good alignment, and then all of a sudden you throw your upper body forward into the throw, and you pull everything out of whack. So I would say focus on maintaining good posture and keeping everything in alignment that will simplify your throw and generally make you more successful. Alright, I have 2 drills that you can do by yourself in your house to work on generating power without having to go out in the cold, without having to go fetch a bunch of discs. The first one, I think one of the things that people are least comfortable with and do least naturally is get their hips into the throw properly. So I think starting out by working on that is a good way to go. For this exercise, again, start with your feet sort of shoulder width apart. Take a step forward out to your right, if you're right-handed, maybe 6 inches to a foot. A foot might be pushing it. Make sure that your front leg there the front knee is bent slightly. Not a lot, so this is locked, this is bent slightly. And that just allows your hips to rotate a little bit more freely than they could if that front knee were locked. From the side here, this is bent slightly, this is locked. And then what you're going to do is don't worry about the shoulders so much. Just stay upright like you normally would, and you're going to rotate your hips. Load up this back leg just like you would normally, and then you're going to come through and push off the back leg and throw your hips forward, transferring the weight to the front foot. So again, wind back and throw your hips forward. You might turn your front foot out a little bit just to take some strain off of your knee. But just practicing this, getting the hips to turn and then getting them to turn fully and go forward, leading your upper body will help with your throw. And notice how much they turn. They're turning, I would say, probably a full 90 degrees from back to forward. From the side, again, I'm taking my step out. Front knee is a little bit bent, and I'm winding up, and then I'm coming through. And my hips are rotating all the way through, and even though I'm not rotating my shoulders all that much, they're still pulling my upper body around. One common mistake that you should be very careful of is if you lock your knee, you are going to have trouble rotating your hips around fully. And what you may end up doing, here I rotate back and then I lock my knee, and I can't really rotate my hips forward in the way that I want to. So I end up just rotating around, and there's actually no weight transfer to my front foot. I've just rotated without generating any power. From this side, see, I rotate back, lock my knee, and then rotate around. And there's really not much getting transferred there. And this is a good time to see how your posture is doing. You may find that when you rotate through, you're letting your upper body go ahead of your hips. This is an opportunity to work on fixing that, where you'll rotate back, your hips go through, and your upper body will stay back behind the hips or just directly above. Now the second exercise incorporates the shoulders and the arm to give you a more full throwing motion. And again, this is an opportunity to identify issues with your posture, to make sure that you are putting yourself in a position to generate as much power as possible. So again, we'll start with our feet at shoulder width. Take your step out, 6, 8 inches, something like that. And then this time you're winding up with without a disc. Just have your hand flat, like you're shaking hands with somebody. Maybe bring your wrist in, cock your wrist just a little bit, and you're bringing your hand back, winding up your shoulders, winding up your hips, and then coming through, again leading with your hips, whipping your shoulders around, whipping your arm around, and your goal here is you're imagining some sort of a target right in front of you, a little bit in front of you, a little bit off to your right, at your release point, which is just going to be a little bit in front of your foot here. And so you're winding up, and you're giving a full speed motion, and you're just trying to slap this imaginary target with the back of your hand. And what this does is it focuses on generating power out of this motion, and it focuses on generating directional power in the direction that you're throwing. So you're not just you're not just a carousel spinning around and then releasing and hoping that it goes in the right direction. Your whole wind up and follow through is pushing the disc on the line to your target, and that's exactly what this drill simulates as well. You're winding up and then pushing out directly at your target. If you want to, if it's more comfortable for you, you can wind up and take a little step. But that's just an added thing. You'll be just as well taking the step first and then winding up and rotating through into it. Alright, just a couple of troubleshooting things based on some symptoms that you might see when you're throwing. One very common one is you might see all of your throws go very, very low. There's a good chance that if this is happening, what you're doing is you're throwing your upper body out in front of your hips, and so instead of staying nice and behind and getting that upward trajectory, you are throwing it forward, and you can see it's adjusting your trajectory to be lower. So if that's happening to you, focus a little bit more on keeping your upper body behind or even with your hips. Now remember, it's okay to be slightly leaned over when you throw, but it's an athletic positioning, not a big folding, and you're not sticking your butt out and preventing your hips from moving. Now, if you're struggling to generate power, if you're you may still generate a decent amount of power if you're throwing your weight a little bit ahead. If you somehow get your hips around, you might just throw really, really hard line drives, and then you can help get a little bit of extra distance out of that by adjusting your trajectory. If you crouch, or if you fold your body over, there's a good chance that you're just going to restrict your hip movement. So remember, the giant step means that I can hardly move my hips at all, and I've just lost all of that power. So if you're struggling to generate power, think about if there's something in your posture that's preventing your hips from rotating through the throw like they should. One of the most common things is a big step, or if not a big step, just even a little step and the crouch that pops your hips back, sticks your butt out, and prevents you from rotating your hips like you should. Other troubleshooting, I think that those are the two most common, and probably the only two worth mentioning right now.